My father has been partially deaf for the last 4 years. He is separated from others, disappearing into his music. He plays all day long now, and it drives my mother nuts. But his playing has gotten really good. He plays it straight. Sure, he must find his own signature in a given piece, the timbre with his instrument, but classical music stands in opposition to the riffing of jazz. Michael Jarrett, in Drifting on a Reed, Jazz as a Model for Writing, discusses the tropic nature of jazz. A trope is, Jarrett reminds us, also a musical term. For Jarrett, jazz is a playful, turning, wandering kind of performance. A kind of following, but also turning away.
Yay!
Going back to school meant I wasn't at home with my family as much as I used to be. That first semester of coursework, I only had one weekday night to spend with my kids. A Wednesday.
It all started with the Brinkerlos, Babbage and Loveless. It's only fitting she was Byron's scion.
During this time, I was enrolled in Jan Holmovik's digital methods course that required us to read a number of texts, one per week, and produce a 3-minute video response. My kids would help me write scripts, record, and edit. They'd run the cameras. This was a co-making process, a process of wandering together, from place to place, often uncertain about where we were headed, but in every case, we were guided by a melody.
Connected, ready for their future.
Together, we made music for the film you're watching now. The film concerns my grandmother who died in an automobile accident when my father was just 18. With my wife, we made this film as a way for us to get to know someone in our family that we never met. Perhaps we could help her speak through the electrate ether. And what effect might this have on us as makers, and perhaps as viewers? My children and I laid down several music tracks using instruments we have around the house. And then we selected and laid out the images on top of the music tracks. My wife and I did the final voices of my grandmother. The film emerged from the music, not the other way around. Film directors often assemble footage using ad hoc soundtracks known as guide pieces. Sometimes the guide is even favored over the score that is written for a film. A famous example of this occurring is 2001 Space Odyssey, where Stanley Kubrick laid out his footage using classical pieces of his own selecting. Kubrick had hired Alex North to write a replacement score for the film once the footage had been edited and in place. Kubrick had already worked with North in Dr. Strangelove and Spartacus, but during the post-production, Kubrick abandoned North's score in favor of his own classical guides. I used the same process of using the music to guide the editing when I made films during my first semester as a PhD student in rhetoric.
I figure essentially, all of these kids' lives, they snuck through the fence, on a dark night and threw rocks into the 70-foot deep dye tanks. I think there's like 9 of them. Somebody falls in there and never gonna hear from that kid again.
See ya.
I wasn't just making films with my kids in grad school, I was also teaching film in my freshman composition class. While Kubrick cut and spliced film using cement, today we use computers laying out audio and video assets on a timeline. The audio lays across the timeline like a landscape of peaks and valleys between long plains of silence. When I teach editing to my students, I teach them to use these visuals to lay out their images.
I want my students to see the tropes in the design, and I want them to think about riffing with what they find.
I made this methodological connection at 4Cs when one of my colleagues, Kevin Smith, a student from Northeastern University, presented at the same digital praxis session as I did. His work, entitled Data Modeling Understanding, the Rhetoric of XML Markup in Writing Classroom, detailed how his students learned to read and write code as a method for teaching genre studies. Smith has his students examine genre in its XML-coded form, and in this code, the genre takes shape. The same is true when making films on Adobe Premiere Pro. Though we're thinking in terms of arrangement of visual shapes instead of code, I've found that my students learn more about how to make films from looking at other students' timelines than they would by looking at their final products. For Smith, using code, and also for my students using Premiere Pro, arrangement can be seen as something physical, a place, a location. Peter Simonson, in his essay, Reinventing Invention Again, argues that every generation finds the need to redefine what is meant by and accept it as invention. Simonson theorizes the key productive tensions at play have been first the affirmation or rejection of prior works and styles on the one hand, and second, location and dispersal on the other. For my students, the timeline becomes a space where invention bumps up against places and points of tension where one can follow or turn away. Using Premiere Pro, making becomes a kind of play. Timber is a difficult thing to explain, a difficult thing to understand. Timber is not found in the musician or in the instrument, but in the relationship between the two. Here we are discussing the quality of the resonance of our being, but also our relationality with other beings, things, and places. A musician's story always involves an instrument and the search for timbre, a kind of communion brought about by listening and understanding.
I also want my students to think about timbre when they're editing, that with practice, they might find a kind of resonance in their making.
For my making process, I chose to listen to the melody, to be guided by it. I have long known the melody, but I have not always understood it. But each time I play it, I wander, I invent, resolved, as Nancy says, into vibrations that both return it to itself and place it outside itself.
And it's a joy when you can go into a restaurant or a hotel or a hospital and play the piano and have people come up and listen and thank you for making beautiful music.